It's important to look at reconciliation through the lens of post-traumatic stress. Our children need the skills to engage in hard conversations, and they need to understand triggers that prevent healing in indigenous communities today. So, blessings in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth. We honor and acknowledge the Mokinstis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, with the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And finally, we acknowledge all nations, indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land, and who honor and celebrate this territory. Hi, I'm Edward C., a volunteer chaplain who is also running for a Catholic trustee position in Calgary Wards 1, 2, and the beautiful town of Cochrane. Every week, I go live to answer your most important questions. And so this week, I'll share my learning from a fellow school council chair about reconciliation through the lens of dealing with trauma. So first, whoa, funky, what happened? It was looking fine before. Looks like the camera view is changed. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry about that. Weird. Okay, hold on a sec. Oh, I see. Clicked on this. Hold on a sec. Sorry about this. There we go. Perfect. It worked. Oh no, it didn't work. Okay. No worries. Sorry about this. Happens. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to give a little bit of background. Let me just set this guy up actually before I start. Yeah, sweet. And what I'll do is maybe I'll just restart it. Apologize for anybody who's joining me and then they have to hear this again. But I think it's important for us to get this right. So it's important to look at reconciliation through the lens of post-traumatic stress. Our children need the skills to engage in hard conversations, and they need to understand triggers that prevent healing in indigenous communities today. So now blessings, of course, we are in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth. We honor and acknowledge the Mokinstis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, with the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. Hi, I'm Edward C. I serve as a volunteer chaplain, and I'm also running for a Catholic trustee position in Calgary, Wards 1, 2, and the beautiful town of Cochrane. Now, every week, I go live to answer your most important questions. And this week, I'll share some of the learnings that I've received from a fellow school council chair about reconciliation through the lens of dealing with trauma. Now, why am I suited to talk about trauma? Well, first, a bit about my background of becoming a chaplain. I started training shortly after the 2013 floods in Calgary, where we were cleaning out flooded basements in the Siksika community a month after the flood. Now, there was an opportunity that I jumped at to learn about training and supporting those with post-traumatic stress and grief following trauma. These are specific courses. And after doing these courses, I really enjoyed them. And this training eventually led me to serving in several organizations as a certified chaplain. In my training as a chaplain, I've had the opportunity to participate in some very eye-opening training courses, including the Road to Mental Readiness, or R2MR, which is a resilience and mental health training offered by the Calgary Police, and the Psychological First Aid, or PFA course, offered by Alberta Health Services, AHS. Now, I wanted to make sure that what I said today, though, comes primarily from the perspectives of the victims. So I'll be referring to the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which is freely available for everyone, and the speakers of the Parenting Decolonized Conference. Now, as a candidate for the Catholic school trustee position, now I recognize that reconciliation is a very emotionally triggering topic, so I can understand why it might be easier to just avoid talking about it. But I argue that this discomfort stems from a lack of training around talking to others who are going through trauma. And it extends not just to our First Nations communities, but also to friends and family who are going through critical health incidents, or they're going through extremely difficult relationship challenges. So the post-traumatic lens is not the only approach to reconciliation. I want to fully admit that this is an extremely hard problem, and there are no quick fixes. However, understanding trauma is a foundational first step. It helps us understand how our actions either help or they harm healing. And it also helps us understand the reasons behind the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you can understand, why do they want this? Why is this important to them? That's really important. So 3 ways that we can help our children see reconciliation from the lens of trauma in Calgary Catholic and abroad include: 1, understanding trauma; 2, understanding indigenous voice and choice; and then the last is understanding triggers. The third is understanding triggers. So again, welcome. If you want, you can pop any comments in the chat before we jump into it. Hello and welcome. Sorry, I put a 1 in there. So we are live, of course, so feel free to ask any questions. If you're still wondering what this is about, we're really talking about understanding reconciliation from the perspective of understanding trauma. Now, that's point number 1. So we're going to begin with understanding trauma. I'm going to write that down. Understanding trauma. So Antoinette Cooper at the Parenting Decolonized Conference said that if we look at the core of reconciliation, we're dealing with trauma. And why did she say this? Because before we can deal with other aspects of reconciliation, we must first deal with trauma. And trauma happens, when does it happen? It happens kind of at the moment of the event. So if there's something that could be a trigger, or if there's something that directly happens to them, there is an initial shock. There's an initial shock event. And during these times, it may be tempting to think about the future and what's the plan, but the main focus, it quickly switches from that to fight or flight survival. So they're in a very different mode. And this means that when the adrenaline is running, really high, we have a tendency to forget some of our basic needs like water and food. So the key is that we cannot really solve everything today. There will come a time where we will deal with more of these problems, but we're in the situation of shock right now. And so in this case, our children can help by just making an environment where it's easier to move from this fight or flight response to what is normal for them. And it's going to vary, right? Like what is normal for them is going to vary from what's normal for us. Now, it can help to move the focus from the event to what they typically do at home. And that maybe is going outside for a walk. You know, like if going outdoors, that's how they deal with it, but then do that. Is it petting a dog? Or is it eating a meal with friends? These could be very normal things for them. And it's not like you're going in and solving everything. You're not. You're just trying to say, like, these are things that you're familiar with, that you're comfortable with. We're just trying to see how we can support that. Now, simply being present and letting the other person know that help's available when they're ready can be a way to just reassure them that they're cared for and loved. And generally, they want to be, like, people want to be listened to. And I see this as, how do you indicate that you're listening to them? I think it has a lot to do with the types of questions that we ask. So are we asking questions like, how's it going? Good. Right? Like sometimes when you hear that question, you start to think, oh, like, how are you doing? Like, and I'm not really looking for a response, right? I'm just looking for you to say good so I can move on to the next conversation. That itself is the problem. We're not saying that we're ready to listen. So what's another way that we could potentially show that we're ready to listen? One could be we just say, how are you holding up? Right? Like it's just a slightly different question. How are you holding up? Tells the other person that we know that they're going through a tough situation, not to say that we understand their situation, but we know it's not easy and that we are here to help them and we are here to listen. It could be even things like if you're talking about, I remember like us having some even just simple conversations like, you know, like, are you taking some of this food back? You know, like these are normal conversations that people have. Those can be helpful as well because it gets them kind of from this mode of like, oh, I'm running away to somebody brought some food and hey, we got to deal with like, what are we going to do? Are we going to bring it home? Those kind of regular conversations. The other thing I would add is people have a tendency to, and this is just a general one because we're insecure about silence, we have a tendency to fill in the blanks. And this tendency isn't going to help with the trauma space. Like it takes time to think of a response because you're so deep emotionally invested in what's going on right now. And so it's important to have opportunities to speak to that issue specifically of how are we going to help individuals with this. And I think that I see this from the perspective of like trauma training is not easy, but it starts with those conversations. And one thing that I have found very helpful prior to like doing this in practice has been just role plays with friends. So you would have other people that are in the same course and you would one-on-one role play with them. So one person is going to have a situation kind of given to them. And then the other person is going to be reading that out. They are going to be like playing out the scenario of what that feels like. And then at the end of this, of course, they can say their feedback about, well, when you said this, it made me feel this way. And it was like, it's so good. Like, I really liked that because that as a type of training tells you not just what the training is, it tells you where the gaps are for your own experience. Like, what are the parts that you are missing that you need to learn? And I think that that's a good way of starting with, okay, yeah, this is how we are going to like handle the like, this is how we would discuss it. Okay. And I think that really when it comes to this experience, there's a lot that can be taught about learning about trauma, but this applies to all aspects of your life, because trauma is a part of the human experience. And so if we can understand that well, I think that this can be useful for all of our children long term. We can get like feels really awkward and we don't know what to say when somebody like I have an aunt who had cancer. Like, what would you say to that individual? Well, if you had trauma training, you wouldn't hesitate in the same way. And I think that's the challenge, is that we feel really uncomfortable of it. Of course it is, because it's new. It's something that we don't get training on. And so some even base level of training I feel is good for everyone. You don't need to be an expert. That's okay, right? Just know a little bit about it. Okay. So the next, and I apologize, I have to be a little bit quick on this one, is I'm going to call it indigenous. And I mentioned this in my platform, voice and choice. Okay. So indigenous, voice and choice. So how do we know like which of the calls to action from the 20-page Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action like are the most important to prioritize today? Well, the key is that we're not going to get it right. So we need to have our First Nations communities and representatives at the decision-making table. The reason for this is that we may never know what would be a trauma trigger for someone in the First Nations community. So why take that risk and go and make a decision that we don't know if it's going to actually be beneficial? Like, no, for sure, when we have them involved. So I do feel that this is one of the things that is difficult. I talk about the importance of voice and choice. It's difficult to guess. I think that we can read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and we can come to a much stronger understanding of Indigenous voices. I think that the work that was done there is incredible. There's a 535 page report. It is public domain. It has images. I know that this material is being used in some schools, which is fantastic because that gives you a base understanding. And I've looked through it, and there is some very compelling individual stories. And it is those stories, of course, that will help you give you an appreciation of that situation. Great. Read the stories, learn about those things. But when it comes to decision making, how would you apply that today? That's the hard part, right? So you know what happened, but the solutions to them are unclear, right? Every solution has consequences. They have knock-on effects. What that means is that you make a decision to do such and such activity, there may be these other risks that you're not aware of. And so how can you be aware of those risks? That is where having the Indigenous voice and choice, and this is like also applies to parent involvement as well. It's like understanding and involving parents in the decision-making process has the same benefits. We don't know what the consequences are. And then that's why having them involved in the discussion makes such a huge difference. Now, I hope that makes sense. Of course, if you have any questions, like feel free to ping me anytime. Still going? Yeah, still going. Okay, good. Yeah, like I think that, what are you wondering? Right? You put a comment down. Happy to respond live to these. You know, this is a time for you, and we're happy to, to make the time available. And I want to also add that when it comes to the voice and choice, knowing the right kind of initiatives, I think that, yes, seeing it from the lens of trauma is two-part. Like, one is that could be one of the ways that you could look at prioritizing, because there are, I think, 20 pages in the Truth and Reconciliation call to action. But which ones would you prioritize? So you could categorize them. So you could save some time by looking at the trauma lens to see like, okay, how do we deal with those ones first? That would be one way of starting the list. And then when it comes to their time, like being respectful of their time, it could be, okay, among these three options, like, is there one that you think would be better? And how would we do it in a way that would be respectful? That would be another way. So it helps because they've already said what they wanted. They've already made it clear. And so I like the idea of that. And so I like the idea that they've already had their voice said here. They've already kind of made some choices as to what they would prefer. But I do think that it's not easy to prioritize them, and it's not easy to know if that helps people today. And I think that's the key, is that it's the indigenous experience is a lived experience. And it is in this lived experience that there still is trauma happening today. And one of the things that Antoinette Cooper, who I referred to earlier, said was that healing from trauma is a natural state of our bodies, right? So, for example, if you get an injury, like a cut, for example, you'll heal naturally. Really, the question is not whether or not healing will occur. It's like, what is preventing healing from occurring? Maybe there's a scab and it keeps getting picked at, right? And that's preventing healing. So, are there things that prevent healing? And can we understand what those are that prevent the natural type of healing from happening? I think that is a really interesting thing to look at from the perspective of trauma, is to think of it as it is a really tough event. And then over time, there is healing that occurs, but there are things that prevent that healing from occurring. There are things that are happening right now that are kind of opening up that wound over and over and over again. And if we can understand what those are, if we can have those communicated to our communities, that can make a big difference. And sometimes it's not even, it is not things that we think about. Like we're not doing it like to try to be cruel on purpose. We just didn't know. And how would you know? Like you would need to be trained on these things. You would need to understand what is a trigger or what is trauma for them. And that leads me to my next point, which is, I think this is a hard point, but I think it's an important one. Understanding triggers. Okay? So understanding triggers is very important because if we don't understand this, if we don't understand the triggers that might impact our indigenous communities, we could end up like causing more harm, even when we think we're doing good. So we may like believe that, oh yes, this is definitely helping those communities, but we may not know for sure, and it may inadvertently trigger someone. So what is a trigger? So if you understand our memories, this is something that is very interesting about our memories, is that they, because of the way that they're stored, like anything can kind of cause a trigger. I remember, it's going to be like a really weird story to share, but I was in, I think, Sylvan Lake or something, and I was walking by, it was a hot day, I was just walking by this garbage can, and there was like a smell from that garbage can, and then immediately like a memory came up. I didn't, think about this, but I think it was a memory of a time when I was in Hong Kong, and I was like walking in the streets, and it had a similar type of smell. And so like a smell could become a trigger. A word could become a trigger. A type of action could become a trigger. And so how do you know what they would like to see? What would be a trigger and what might cause this? Like, it's very hard to know these kinds of things, but understanding some of the stories and understanding some of the actions that happened during these times can be very, very helpful. So, for example, I already mentioned that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is a 535-page report. That's in the public domain. Of course, it includes historical images, of course, from Archives Canada. And this report already is a strong source for hearing the Indigenous voices today. But, and here's a big but, it's not enough, right? Like just having that alone isn't enough to, I know, I will know how to understand, I will understand all of the triggers. But I think that it's a starting point. It doesn't hurt to have that. And so some of the stories included the way that they were separated or segregated. So I could see actions that lead to that type of segregation being very traumatic or triggering trauma for anybody who's been through that experience. I could see the connection, right? Like the separation between the school and the parents as another type of trigger where they feel like disconnected from their own children. They're not as involved. That can be a big part of it. Language is mentioned in the calls to action. Their language is very important to them because that was something that was taken away. So being able to have options in their language is very important to them. Having everything in one language is can be very traumatic, can be very reminiscent of what they experienced. Other ones included understanding that, I think it was the communications. So communications where the Indigenous communities, what they were going to write, every letter that they were going to write was reviewed, vetted, scripted by the authorities at the time. That can be very traumatic as well because this is a reminiscent, it's replaying. All it is just replaying acts that had happened before. We may just see it as this is common practice. Vetting your public relations. Yes, right, it is. But from their perspective, they may see it differently. And so I don't know for sure. And that's one of the reasons why Indigenous voice and choice is very important when it comes to any types of discussions about what you might do for those communities. No doing anything for the communities without having them at the decision-making table. And I think that is something that will be very helpful as a double check just to make sure that we're on the right page. And so I hope that makes sense. This is something that is very important to me. I think that if it is the case, and this happened recently, the school name of the Bishop Grandin High School was a trigger. The name itself became a trigger, a memory trigger for many in the Indigenous communities. And so, of course, there was a call to change the name of the school. And I think that was very appropriate to make a change to the name of this school because it is very much traumatic. And that's the whole goal here is to support healing. And so in that case, I feel this is causing trauma. What are this is the thing that is, if this is the thing that is opening the wound and preventing healing, I think taking it very seriously is important. And this is not the only one. There are other ways that this happens on a daily basis that we don't even think about. And so what has helped in this and how does that relate back to the trauma training, the trauma lens? Well, this is interesting because people say the same things about trauma. So, for example, simply take a look at people who have gone through extremely traumatic events. And it is in these, I watched a bunch of videos of individuals who had gone through very traumatic events and how certain things really, it really triggered them. For example, somebody who had gone through the loss of family because of a big flood, he was describing how he got very little, next to no sympathy from his boss, the kind of get over it, what's wrong with you kind of thing. And I think those types of things really made things worse for him. And he describes the experience of how it felt to go through that. Yes. Oh, Alice is here. Alice says, communication is key and discussion and consensus is important. Discussion and consensus are important. Yes. So to this point, Alice, it is in those discussions that you start to get the subtleties of the why. And I think that people, if they don't understand the why, then the act has no meaning. If somebody told you to wear a particular color shirt, but you are not clear as to why you are wearing this, like why, like orange, to talk about residential schools, right? Like, if you are not clear on why that is the case, then we have a problem. Then the point of this activity has been missed. And it is more important for it to be genuine, and it comes from that communication, having those discussions. Share the experiences, right? What those people went through. You will have like much more empathy for the individual when you hear their stories. And that's what I love about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If anything, I wish that instead of having it all written as a really big report, like a 500-page report, I wish they, like, if there were more videos of what people had gone through, like people just clip those and we could show those in classrooms, that would be a powerful reminder of what that experience was like from their perspective. And we did the same. We did the same when we learned about trauma. Grief following trauma, critical incident stress management. It was hearing stories of real people who have gone through extremely traumatic events, and they describe how other people reacted to them. People avoided me because they didn't want to talk to me because I was like this weird broken person. Oh, okay. So understanding like, oh, this is really important. So I love that. You know, you also mentioned that the discussion, the consensus component is very important. That's the big factor that I see, is that in this case, especially when it comes to reconciliation and trauma, it was like what was traumatic was the loss of choice, the loss of freedom. And so I can see any types of decisions that are made without that type of discussion, consensus, agreement as being traumatic. They made a decision and I wasn't involved. I can see that being extremely traumatic because it's like they made tons of decisions and I wasn't involved. And so understanding that as a trigger, like to me, that is very powerful. Because once you have this perspective on, oh, it is these triggers, it is these things that we're doing, we don't even notice that is preventing healing, then you can start working towards, well, what would help? And sometimes it's not like, oh, I come in and, you know, I got to solve all the, like, no. Right? Like healing is a personal process. And they need, like, all you can do is create the environment that is conducive to healing. You can create the systems, the environments that support healing. It is up to the other individual whether or not they accept any help. It is their choice, right? Some people may choose not to. Some people will reach out. That is not up to you. It's not up to us to make that decision. However, I do think that it is having that kind of environment that we have checked the systems. We know for certain that these are not causing more trauma. We are consulting on them on many of our key decisions that we think maybe don't necessarily involve them. It doesn't matter. We still want them involved. Like, I think that having an Indigenous person on the board, like on the board of trustees, where all the decisions are making, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt, right? Having somebody who is the representative at every board decision meeting, that's not a bad idea. right? Like you do want to have that perspective there, because like it's very hard for the board alone if they don't have like a person on there making some advice. It's very hard to make good decisions that are helpful for that community. So I hope that helps provide a little bit of my perspective on it. I'm following the advice of Antoinette Cooper from the Parenting Decolonized Conference. I was really influenced by, like, some of you have watched the movie The Hate You Give. To me, it kind of reminded me a lot of like what the experience was of what people had to go through, and who they identified as, and what all this was. And so at the end of all of this, it just reminded me how trauma is really there, and how sometimes, like, The Hate You Give, the whole message behind it was, if you haven't watched the movie, I hope I don't spoil it for you, is that we're transferring a lot of that hate onto our own kids, not realizing it. We're just reacting to the world in a very normal way, but we don't realize that it's actually triggering. It's triggering a new type of hate, and that's the kind of hate that just, it creates a society full of hate, right? Because we grow up in it. Let's see. So I've got another from Alice saying, the opportunity to choose to be involved or not to be involved is also important. Yeah. Voice and choice. So when it comes to being able to choose to be involved, they can say, like, we want to have nothing to do with this. Totally cool. Right? Or we don't want that help. Right? This is good. This is good news. To me, this is really a key, is that who's driving reconciliation? If we're driving it, I feel like that could be a mistake, because it's very easy to move down in a direction very quickly and realize, oh, this wasn't helpful at all. If they're driving it, well, that's different. And I think that's why people start off with the truth and reconciliation calls to action. Those are made by the indigenous communities. So we can say, like, that's where it's being driven from. Now, in terms of the implementation, that's not easy either. So we can then go, okay, we also, help them. We also went back to those communities and we said, well, this is what we see from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We were thinking, like, this might be a good venue. Is this in the right direction? Are we moving in the right direction? Is this something that you would like to be involved with? Is this something, and that's a good indicator too. Think about it, right? Like, somebody saying, yeah, that's good, and I want to help. I want to be a part of it. Like, that is great validation that you are moving in the right direction. That is great validation that you are making a positive impact. And so that's what we want. We want them so interested in what we're doing that they want to be involved. They choose to volunteer. You can imagine something where you're doing that and, like, parents choose to volunteer, like you do some parent activity and you're like, that's so cool. How can I get involved with that? You're moving in the right direction, right? If people are willing to volunteer their time. So again, like, my goal here with today's discussion is not to say we've got all the solutions. Obviously, this is a process that takes time. But I also wanted to say that with anything, having volunteers and having people who are willing to help out is a good sign that you are moving in the right direction. And speaking of, volunteers, I am super thankful that I've had several more, like, families just asking for, where can I get a lawn sign? And we have more lawn signs made, finally. We've made a few this weekend, and then we're going to be distributing them as soon as possible. And the interesting thing is, I was told by my printer that the prices for materials have already gone up 15% in the last month. So this is probably no surprise, like, of course, during the election, but you can still order a lawn sign at edwardtse.com. And so from there, there's a get a lawn sign, there's like a signs or order. You can click on order at the top right, and then that's a way of ordering your lawn sign. And of course, I've also had some school council chairs that I had met at the Alberta School Councils Association. They reached out to me of like, hey, great, how can I volunteer? So to volunteer, you can go to edwardtse.com, edwardc.com, and there's a button in the first paragraph called Get Involved. If you click on this form, if you'd like to donate or volunteer for this campaign, you can just click the buttons right there, like in the Get Involved form. It's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to do. We've been working on that as well. And I want to thank Enoch for writing another testimonial that I've been able to add to the site. It's really nice to have your words of encouragement. I think that these types of things are very important, right? Like people are looking for, well, what value do you provide? Why? Oh, thank you. So Alice says, go, Dr. Ed. Yes. So thank you for that. So really, these types of social proofs are very important. They make a big difference because people don't know you, and you're starting cold for most people. And I think it's important to talk about, well, I've known this person for some time, and they've made a big impact on some aspect of my life. So Alice has written a testimonial as well. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. That said, one of the things that we are experimenting with this month is something called like a chat form. So when you go to edwardc.com, there's a little like chat box, and you can just click it, and then it can answer some questions. So if there's any like about the platform, it can answer them like immediately, which is kind of cool. Like that you can create these types of like chat responders. But if it isn't able to answer your question, then it like sends a message directly to the team, which is awesome. Because then they can see the response. They can write in the chat. You can get a response fairly quickly. But if you can't, like, please leave an email address, and then we'll email you the response. But I like this idea of more accessibility and being able to ask questions anytime, because it's hard these days. Like we're all self-isolating. You know, everybody could be in different locations or different times. It may not be convenient for you to reach out in person. Or maybe you have a busy week. So it's a way to ask your questions. It's a way to connect and find out more directly on the site. So that is another great way. And of course, any social media platform on Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it, you know, that's something that we are involved with. Yeah. So again, thank you so much for your time today. To me, and thank you so much for the support for the campaign. You know, honestly, I've been blown away by the amount of support. And I've got this picture. I don't know if I can show it to you guys, just of like all of the different homes that have they've opened up as a result of this. And they said like, yeah, I really want I really want your lawn signs. And so I don't know if you can see these, but like all of these are different pictures of lawns and stuff that people wanted signs. So there's quite a few. And that has a lot to do with the community just being very supportive, and it's made a big difference. And I hope, and it is my prayer that, you know, no matter what happens, some of these concepts and ideas can apply to individual schools. They can apply to parents directly. They can also apply to like ideas that the board uses, whether or not I am elected. I've made some arrangements to visit, to attend some masses and distribute some like more materials as well. So I have a poster handout as well. So that can be available if you can click on the order button and you can get those as well. Of course, free of charge. Yeah. So thank you very much. Next week, I think we're going to dive a little bit more deep into this topic of health and wellness, because I do think that health and wellness is and remains a strong concern. We're seeing a lot of discussion around health and wellness in online in the community, especially here in Alberta. And I think it's important to have some discussions around what does that mean, and what are the things that we need. What are people looking for? So I appreciate your time. I apologize. I have another event that I need to run to at this time. I will catch up with you next week where we'll talk a little bit more about health and wellness. Thank you. See you next time.